Radio.
Good morning to you. This is talkRadio Breakfast with me, Julia Hartley-Brose. Thank you very much indeed for your company. Now, let's talk about what's happening in Israel and on the Gaza Strip. Israeli jets carried out further airstrikes over Gaza as the EU and others have called for a de-escalation from both sides. 130 rockets were fired by Hamas at Tel Aviv. 2 Israeli women died. That's in response to an Israeli airstrike on a tower block in Gaza in which 26 Palestinians were killed, including a number of children, I believe 9 children. This coming, of course, after originally strikes from Hamas on Jewish settlements in Israel, of course. And, of course, a lot of this started back on Monday when we were looking at hostilities escalating after police clearing Muslims at a very holy site for both Jews and Muslims in East Jerusalem. I suppose you can go back to Monday and you can go back many, many decades as well. But why are we in this situation right now and what can resolve it? Well, let's talk to Dr. Alan Mendoza. He's Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society. Good morning to you, Alan.
Good morning, Julia.
I do think for a lot of people, and I include myself in this, that when we see stories like this break out, and you'll see the footage, and some of the footage of those rocket attacks on Israel are quite extraordinary. A number of them did get through, despite their extraordinary defences they have in Israel. A lot of people just have a sort of feeling, well, I don't really understand what's going on. I don't know who started it. I don't know who's to blame, and kind of want to steer clear. But can we discuss this without the blame game? Like, when did this latest spate of attacks start, and why did it start?
Well, it depends on, as usual, unfortunately, what you think is the starting point to think. And you've got 2 different things going on here. You've got some internal disturbances within Israel, and you've got external assault from the Gaza Strip. What we're seeing, of course, at the moment are the rockets raining down on Israel, the response from Israel to those rockets, though that's what's driving the current agenda. But there's also internal civil unrest, which the Israeli forces have had to, sort of police and manage as well. So you've got 2 separate things happening. And so I suppose the question is, as with your preamble to this, where does this all start? But it tends to start always with, if you like, the Palestinian side in the debate starting something, whether it is rioting, stone throwing, attacking Jewish worshippers at the Western Wall, sending rockets over, and Israel then responding to that situation.
But we did see. I mean, there were some independent media observers of what was happening at the mosque, and saying that actually it was very heavy-handed policing, and young people who were there who were doing absolutely nothing were being treated in a very heavy-handed way. Some 300 injuries, and whether or not actually Israel the authorities had provoked some of this action. And again, you're hearing different things on different sides. I mean, let's take this all the way back to the creation of Israel at this point. I mean, that's where it always ends up going, doesn't it? Who did what first?
Well, I mean, you can go back to the creation of Islam if you want to go back and back and back, really, if you want to sort of take it that way. But look, when it comes to this setup, you can argue the Israelis were heavy-handed, but then you've got to look at why were they in there in the first place. They weren't there to start a fight. They were there to stop a fight. In fact, they were there to stop a fight because Palestinians on one of the holiest sites of Islam were using that holy site to rain missiles down onto Jews worshipping one of their holiest sites below. So if you really want to start it from that basis, why were they using one of the holiest sites of Islam as a staging post for stone throwing? What was the relevance of that? Why were they attacking Jews praying below? Is that a normal thing to do from a religious site, Julia?
Yeah, it's all a fair point. Now, we often see death tolls are wildly different. So 2 Israeli women we know died from those 130 rockets, which Hamas say they have fired at Tel Aviv. 26 Palestinians dead, and of course, there have been criticism of Israel for airstrikes on a tower block. They say they were targeting Hamas, militiamen. They're targeting them in their homes. We know it is a deliberate policy by Hamas, which is a terrorist organisation that runs, this area. That they deliberately put themselves and stage their rocket attacks from civilian areas for their own protection. But there is going to be criticism, and understandable criticism of Israel for, even though the right to retaliate, 100%, I defend that, attacking civilian sites in these scenarios is only going to inflame things worse.
Well, you say that, Julie, but again, it comes down to what you're dealing with. Let's imagine for a second that it was London being rained down missiles upon, and the British government had to respond to that. Do you think, and the British government knew where the missiles were coming from, where the militias were targeting, do you think the British government would go, oh, actually, we're not worried about civilian deaths on our side, let's let them use that and get on with it? Or do you think the British government would respond? I think the British government would respond. And it's worth noting that what the Israelis do when they attack civilian sites like this, which let's not forget are not civilian sites at that moment in time because they're being used by terrorists, they actually do what's called the knock on the door first. They give warning several hours in front that they are going to be attacking that building. They basically allow the civilians to leave, and anyone who wants to stay then knows essentially what they're getting into. It's not ever the case that Israelis will attack something in a civilian area without warning them. That's why the Israeli Defense Forces remain the most ethical force in the world, because they actually warn the other side that they're coming before they come in and do that. What they're trying to do, though, is to stop those sites being used for attacks on Israel. And that's essentially what they have to do.
There is no doubt in my mind, and we saw this with all the Corbynistas who were obsessed with Israel over any other country in the Middle East, never seemed to be worried about what was happening by the Assad regime in Syria. Though we do hold Israel, in the West, we hold Israel to a much higher standard, a far, far higher standard than we hold any of the other countries in that part of the world that are not true democracies. And that is an issue that Israel has to play. However, how will this be resolved? Because, if at all, because we're in the situation, of course, where although Israel has signed effectively peace treaties with, and we just recognise their existence, right to exist in the Middle East with a number of Muslim countries, we know that what happens in Palestine is often used as sort of an excuse, as a totemic event to increase more tensions in the Middle East. There are always going to be concerns about how these things can escalate, not just between Israel and Palestine, but across the Middle East.
Well, now you're into something very interesting, actually, Julia, because by bringing in the wider picture, you begin to sort of get at what's really going on here. As you know, the terrorist organisations from the Gaza Strip are supported by one country in the region, Iran. Yeah. Iran, we know, has been put on the back foot by the peace deal signed by Israel with various Arab states in the Gulf and others in that way, and has been looking at a way to get back at Israel for various nuclear-related preventative attacks that the Israelis have made in Iran. And here's their opportunity. By using a terrorist group funded by Iran, they can firstly get Israel sucked into a border battle with Gaza. Secondly, they can try and influence opinion in the region. And thirdly, they can try and create a wider conflagration without, of course, getting themselves caught up in it in that way. And that's the important thing. Where are the Gazans getting their rockets from and the money to fund them? It's all coming from Iran.
Okay, absolutely fascinating. Really good to talk to you, Dr. Alan Mendoza, Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society. 8 o'clock is the time.